All right, welcome everybody. Good afternoon, or well, if you're on the West Coast, still good morning. My name is Brian Grady. I am the Assistant Executive Director for Labor Market Information here at the South Carolina Department of Employment and Workforce. I also serve on the steering committee for the ACS Data Users Group. So let me welcome you to our 2:30 session on synthetic data. And we have three awesome presentations coming up for you today. Any questions that you have for the speakers, please put those in the Q&A tab at the right side of your screen. And with that, I will go ahead and introduce our first speaker, Joseph Tisillo, who is going to talk to us about Veterans Health Administration patients. So let's get into it.
All right, thanks for the intro, Brian. My name is Joe Tisillo. I'm a research scientist in the Human Geography group at Oak Ridge National Lab. Today I'll be talking about some preliminary work that my team has been doing to support the VA in better understanding access gaps to points of care among Veterans Health Administration patients. This work is motivated by two kind of broad challenges. The first is understanding population heterogeneity among VHA patient populations in terms of characteristics like demographic, economic mobility, and housing characteristics. Not from a population level, but from an individual level, and kind of thinking about these cross-sectional representations of people, both by where they live and the kinds of circumstances that they inhabit, and how that kind of affects the way that they access different points of care. And then the second challenge is thinking about real-world resource access with respect to transportation networks. Thinking about impedances like physical barriers to travel that change kind of the level of accessibility that individuals have to those locations where they seek medical treatments. So to address each of these challenges, we apply synthetic populations, which are complete virtual realistic representations of the population of people and households in an area of interest that allow us to evaluate kind of these large-scale scenarios of understanding access issues. This work is powered by a project that's been at ORNL since about 2015 called UrbanPop, which generates high-fidelity synthetic populations for the United States, powered by the ACS and the PUMS. We create representations of individual agents who travel to various activities like healthcare and nutrition, seeking services based on representations of individuals and households that are provided by the PUMS and matching them to small neighborhood characteristics. So this allows us to simulate travel at scale for kind of a large subset of the population, like VHA patients. So the backbone of this is our ability to produce residential synthetic populations. Our population synthesizer relies on a maximum likelihood model that reproduces the 90% margins of error in the ACS summary file. So essentially, when the characteristics of people and households are aggregated up to the scale of small neighborhood areas like census block groups and tracts, where we're kind of downscaling the data to, those synthetic aggregate estimates kind of faithfully conform to the 90% margins of error that are available for each of those summary file estimates of the variables that we're interested in constraining our population on. We then attribute our synthetic population via record linkage with the PUMS. Each person and household combination is a derivative of one of the PUMS records. One of those attributes is dwelling type, which then allows us to perform residential downscaling. Essentially, every synthetic household selects a dwelling available in the FEMA USA structures data set to reside in, and that becomes the starting point for a journey to, in this case, a VA outpatient facility. And so looking at the problem of modeling access to VA points of care in more detail, how we handle kind of this applied case is first selecting synthetic VHA patients via PUMS record linkage. So there's a variable for VHA health insurance coverage in the PUMS that we use as a flag for subsetting our larger synthetic population. And then we apply some network partitioning techniques such that each synthetic patient begins their travel at the node of the road network closest to their point of residence. And then from there, we can evaluate the network-based impedance based on time between patient home locations and all of the available points of care in an area of interest. So here's an example result for just one of the Veteran Integrated Service Networks, or VISN networks, for Central Illinois. On the left panel, we have the distribution of synthetic VHA patients. On the right, we have the mean least cost travel time to each VA outpatient clinic in blue. So on the left, larger urban centers obviously have higher concentrations of VHA patients, but we also see kind of locally high counts of these patients in smaller towns kind of interspersed within rural areas. And comparing this to the panel on the right, we begin to see kind of where some access gaps might exist. For example, this patch of residential locations here is Champaign-Urbana, which doesn't have an outpatient facility like some of these other cities surrounding it. There's a higher time-based impedance in accessing those clinics. And then similarly, as you get further out on the rural fringe, fewer patients have sort of quick access to points of care. So for our initial patient mobility analysis, we essentially took this approach and applied it to 9 of those VISN markets, one representing each of the 9 census divisions across the continental US. Our synthetic population is based on the ACS 2015 to 2019 5-year estimates. And we were interested in comparing these synthetic mobility patterns to observed VHA patient data from the VA's corporate data warehouse. So in our initial exercise, we looked at both the core market definition, so just the market boundaries as a self-contained spatial extent for travel, and then a core market plus surrounding edge counties with their own outpatient clinics in them to investigate edge effects. So yeah, as I discussed in the previous slide, we looked primarily at the drive network to start, modeling outpatient clinic locations available from the VA, and then evaluating the least cost path travel time, as well as the grand mean travel time to all clinics in the area of interest. And then finally, for validation, we examined kind of how the full synthetic population, how effectively it recreates neighborhood demographics based on the ACS margins of error, and then compared synthetic and observed mobility trajectories for the simulated travel. So here's an overview of the selected VISN markets by US Census Division with the edge counties around each market delineated in gray. You can see that for those larger extents, we capture a few more VA outpatient clinic facilities that we might expect the synthetic patients to travel to. So here are the summary statistics for travel times within each of those markets. So the rankings for mean least cost travel and the sort of grand mean of travel times were fairly consistent across the markets. Markets like Mid-Atlantic, which contains New York City, and West-South Central, which contains San Antonio. These places with large urban centers tended to have the lowest drive time-based impedances, whereas those in the Midwest with a mixture of rural and kind of smaller urban areas tended to have the highest overall travel times. And this generally held considering both core market areas as well as the core market and edge area of interest definitions. So looking a little more in depth at the travel time along least cost paths, two kind of distinct patterns begin to emerge in those market areas with more concentrated urban centers. We tend to see kind of a histogram with a high right skew. Many patients who have access to an outpatient facility in 30 minutes or less. For those that have longer travel times, we observe more of a bimodal pattern where patients that are situated in those urban areas that have an outpatient facility have kind of quicker access to that facility than those that are either in smaller towns or urban areas without those facilities, as well as those out on the kind of the rural fringe, as I demonstrated in that previous slide. This pattern is also consistent between kind of the core market and core market plus edge area of interest definitions. In the latter of these, we see kind of a less extreme right skew in most of these histograms because patients are able to access facilities that might be kind of closer to the edge of the market boundaries in which they reside. So moving on to validation. Again, this was a comparison of the full synthetic population to the published margins of error in the ACS summary file. So these density plots show the kind of the density of block groups within each VISN market that conformed to a certain level of the ACS 90% margins of error. Those are generally within 98 to 100% of kind of the constraining variables that we use to create our synthetic population. The heavy sort of left tail on these distributions indicates some block groups within each market that are predominantly group quarters and military populations that are more difficult to accurately synthesize. And then for VHA patient mobility, we compared origin destination matrices based on flows between each patient's home zip code and the outpatient facility zip code. For the synthetic patients, we accomplished this by georeferencing their home locations by ZICTA-5s that intersected with the market area. And then we applied canonical correlation analysis, or CCA, to evaluate the strength of association between the observed and synthetic origin destination matrices. So there's a kind of a toy example of this on the right. A strong association that gives a high R-squared value would be kind of similar relative high and low values between the observed and synthetic origin destination matrix. Whereas they're somewhat more out of alignment for two origin destination matrices with a weak association. So here are those CCA statistics across our 9 markets. We found that for the market-only area of interest definitions, we had generally a higher CCA R-squared than when we accounted for the edge counties. And in general, we observed kind of a modest to strong association between our synthetic and observed origin destination trajectories. So to kind of recap everything, we found that VISN markets in this preliminary example, based on driving alone, visit markets with large urban centers tended to have reduced travel time to outpatient clinics, whereas those with kind of mixed urban and rural patient locations and small to mid-sized urban centers had increased travel time, particularly in the Midwest. At the same time, we also observed kind of a weaker association between those visit markets containing large urban centers with respect to the origin destination trajectories that we captured from our mobility simulation, which might suggest that our results are confounded by patients accessing outpatient facilities through other modes like public transportation. And then, our market-only areas of interest tended to better represent observed patient mobility than those defined by the core and edges, suggesting that the spatial extents of the visit markets might be kind of already fairly well defined and self-contained. So moving forward, we're actively working to extend this approach. We've just modernized the synthetic populations to the ACS 2019 to 2023 5-year estimates. And we've accounted in our population synthesis procedure for new factors, constrained our model on health insurance coverage directly to more effectively identify patients, as well as accounted for telehealth access via ACS variables representing internet coverage. So moving forward, we're interested in developing a larger scale comparative analysis of hopefully all VHA visit markets across the United States based on factors like urbanicity, like a gradient from very low density rural to dense urban areas where patients are located, based on the global human settlement layer, as well as age-based characteristics. And then, expanding travel modalities beyond just driving to others like walk and bike infrastructure and public transit to more effectively capture those flows between patient residences and outpatient facilities. And then finally, a parallel effort within Urban Pop is developing synthetic population ensembles, where we develop many realizations of what an area's population composition might look like, and then we can apply those to perform uncertainty quantification on the methods that we're developing. So with that, I want to thank you for your time, and I welcome your questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Joseph. Next, we have remarks from Stephen Ruggles, who is Regents Professor at the University of Minnesota and Director of the Indispensable IPUMS. Take it away, Stephen.
Okay. Let me share my screen. Okay. Well, Joseph just gave us a very effective example of the powerful use of synthetic data to measure something we couldn't, or estimate something we just couldn't get at otherwise. And I'm going to talk about a less effective application of the approach. But first of all, say a word about the invention of microdata. The Census Bureau created the first public use microdata file in, we've now learned it's in the first January of 1963. And the idea was to meet the demand for customized tabulations, and they simply took a sample of the records that they were using to make the published tabulations. At that time, census data was mostly distributed in printed volumes, and they disseminated it on tape and on punch cards. They worried about confidentiality, but they decided that by removing detailed geographic information and all other potentially identifying variables, that it has been determined that making records available in this form, it falls within the confidentiality rules of the Census Bureau. So it was a big deal. It had a huge impact on social science. Otis Dudley Duncan, perhaps the best known social theorist of the era, wrote that the importance of this innovation can hardly be overestimated. With access to the unit records, the social scientist may specify in detail how variables are to be manipulated so as to produce an optimal estimate of the magnitude desired. So ACS microdata are now among the world's most intensively used scientific data sources. So after 1960, the Census Bureau released similar samples, but bigger and more detailed for 1970, 1980, 1990, and 2000. Then in 2000, they decided to switch the long form to the American Community Survey, and they switched the microdata samples as well. And so far, we've got information on 140 million people. If you add together all the microdata samples that from the decennial census and the ACS, and 51 million households. And it is probably the most intensively used data source in the social sciences. There's over 50,000 citations of the microdata in Google Scholar, just the ACS microdata, 5,400 ACS microdata dissertations. And we at IPUMS have fielded 2.7 million requests from 250,000 different investigators for these data. So that currently works out to 21,000 data requests per month. So it's very, very high volume. So I used to claim that ACS microdata was like a Hubble telescope for social science, but I've kind of realized that undercuts the true impact, because the Hubble telescope, even though it's quite a bit more expensive than the ACS, it hasn't yielded anywhere near as many publications. So the Census Bureau has moved beyond the disclosure control methods that were employed in 1960. Skinner et al. In 1994 divided disclosure control methods into two broad categories: those that preserve data integrity, and then what they call contamination methods. And the ones they used in 1960 were the ones that preserve data integrity. They use sampling and suppression of detail. Sampling in itself makes it difficult or impossible to verify a link between an identified individual, an outside source, and a microdata record in a census sample, because a person might be unique within the sample, but they may or may not be unique within the population, and it's very hard to prove that they are unique within the population, because the Census Bureau doesn't release information about the whole population. So the other approach they used in 1960 was detail suppression. That's rounding or top coding, bottom coding, and suppressing small categories of data. There's limitations to this. It does limit some of the things you can study. You can't study centenarians, for example, with PUMS data, but we accept that fact, and we don't try to study those things. But generally speaking, those are variables, approaches that users like. Users are less fond of the contamination methods, like swapping, age perturbation, and partially synthetic group quarters, which are the other three methods that are used in the current ACS PUMS. Swapping is where you and for microdata files in particular, it works a little differently for the summary files. But for the microdata files, the swapping focuses on cases that pose a disclosure risk. That usually means households that have unique characteristics within the geographic area. And what you do is you find a household that matches on other key characteristics nearby in the area, and you swap their geographic identifiers. And that makes it always introduces uncertainty as to whether an individual household that you're looking at actually is located within the geographic unit that it's shown in, and makes positive identification extremely difficult. Age perturbation has also been used since 2000 in the ACS and in the 2000 census microdata. The initial methods they used to do the age perturbation were flawed. There's a literature on this that I can point you to. And it really introduced systematic bias into the results. The age perturbation, fortunately, is only done for large units with more than 10 people, and for persons with older than 65 or older. So the Census Bureau acknowledged the problem and re-released the data with new age perturbation. Unfortunately, the new age perturbation was, for some applications, even more biased than the old age perturbation. So this is not a success story, and users should be very cautious in the ACS about using single years of age over 65 for persons over 65. The final methods used was just for group quarters, and this is partially synthetic data, and this focused on it was targeted to high-risk cases, households with unusual combinations of characteristics within a geographic area, and also focused on potentially identifying variables, especially age. And so it does seem like the contamination was minimal, and this approach is probably okay. Well, at the ACS Data Users Conference, in 2021, Rolando Rodriguez described the Census Bureau's plans to replace the American Community Survey data with fully synthetic data by 2024. Obviously, this is the timeline that he gave. Internal review in 21, internal test in 22, external test in 23, release in 24. Obviously, this did not occur. And we know, though, that at least as of 5 months ago, the Census Bureau said that they were continuing to work on this and plans were moving forward, but we have had no update on the progress in a couple of years. So the idea of synthetic microdata for the ACS is to develop models describing the interrelationships of all the variables in the ACS, and then you construct a simulated population consistent with those models. And obviously, this kind of model data can only capture relationships between variables if they've been anticipated in advance and intentionally included in the models. And unfortunately, that makes synthetic microdata poorly suited to discovering new things. And so this is from a 2020 Census Bureau working paper that describes the procedure. You sequentially model each variable in turn based on the previously modeled variables, and you create the fully synthetic data. And then, because the synthetic data is not actually useful for research, you allow users to validate the results from the synthetic microdata against the actual real data within the Census Bureau. And then you conduct disclosure review for those results, and you let people have the results. So that's the plan. The modeling is not easy. There's thousands of interrelationships among variables. And if you consider interrelationships across household members, there's millions of interrelationships among variables. And it just gets very, very complicated very quickly. This particular Census Bureau working paper describes attempts to model health insurance. Well, health insurance is complicated because it depends on family composition. Often one policy covers multiple family members, and they found that that was very difficult to do. This is also true for lots and lots of other variables we're interested in, including such a basic thing as just the measurement of poverty. Depends on multiple people's characteristics in the household. So the paper concludes that none of the methods they tried yielded adequate results. So as I indicated, a central part of the proposed synthetic data process is validation. The synthetic data is not going to be appropriate for use for research purposes. It's just to test your data on. And so the idea is that researchers will conduct their analyses on the synthetic data. Then they submit the code, their Stata scripts or their R, to the Census Bureau, and the Census Bureau will then run it on the real internal data. Then they put the output through disclosure control and give the results back to the researcher. Well, there's one major previous example of synthetic population microdata with a validation server that's followed this model, and this is the SIP synthetic beta file. That file combines data from the Survey of Income and Program Participation with data from Social Security. And the Census Bureau contracted with Cornell University to run the validation server for this data set. Well, internal and external evaluations of the SIP synthetic beta found it was pretty limited and usage was limited. During the first 7 years the validation service was operational at Cornell, about 170 investigators signed up to use the SIP synthetic data. But then of these, only 8 out of every 100 requested validation services. So maybe about 14 projects during those 7 years were validated. And the Census Bureau says, without validation of results, there's no guarantee of the validity of the data for any research purpose. And so, not surprisingly, there have not been a significant number of substantive research publications that have come out of this work. Well, the ACS microdata generates at least 100,000 times as much traffic as the SIP synthetic beta. And if all those researchers were forced to use the synthetic ACS, the Census Bureau would then have to carry out tens of thousands, at least, of validations every year, maybe hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of disclosure evaluations of the results. And it's quite clear that the Census Bureau has nowhere near the resources that would need to be needed to handle this kind of workload. They didn't actually end up having even the capacity to support the trickle of users of the synthetic SIP. The Cornell Synthetic Data Server, which had been handling the dissemination of synthetic SIP for the Census Bureau, announced in 2022 that they were shutting down due to a lack of resources. And so it was completely dead for 2 years. And then last August, 2 years later, the Census Bureau set up a new validation service. There's no information I can find about whether anyone has used it yet. The web page itself has shown no changes since the validation was inaugurated in July 2024. So the reason why you need to go through all these hoops, according to the Census Bureau, is to protect respondent confidentiality. Now, this is a graphic from Rodriguez's 2001 presentation that I mentioned before, and he acknowledged that there had never been any public disclosures of anyone's identity from public use census data, but he thought, there could be. There might be unknown risks in the future, and that's why we have to get rid of the ACS, real ACS microdata. But the confidentiality risks are extraordinarily low. There's only one published study that's examined the confidentiality risks of the ACS microdata. It's a re-identification analysis conducted at the Census Bureau, and one of the authors was a Census Bureau staff member. And the study found that 0.017% of respondents were vulnerable to re-identification, but almost 4 in 5 of those putative re-identifications were incorrect, and an outsider would have no means of determining which ones were correct. So there were just a few dozen cases in the places they looked at where there was even a possibility of re-identification, and the vast majority of those cases where they got a match between external sources and the microdata were wrong. And so that means that the microdata disclosure controls that are in place are working. There's no realistic way for an outsider to positively identify any particular respondent. Any guess you make is usually going to be wrong. And so the uncertainty is the point of the traditional disclosure controls, and they seem to be working pretty well. So I argue that we need more research. The one replication study we have shows that the current re-identification list appears to be very low, and that positive identification of a respondent would be impossible. But that study's over a decade old, and new data and methods have become available. We need new re-identification studies using the latest data and methods to identify realistic risks. And then if we find these realistic risks, then we can develop targeted solutions to address the risks. The one thing we do learn from the existing study is that the risk appears to be confined to a very small group of outliers, and one would have the potential to address those outliers without harming the data integrity for most of the population. And another area we need new research is research on the scientific impact of new disclosure controls. We learned this in the differential privacy fiasco, and we need to figure out what is the actual impact of disclosure, of the new disclosure control methods of synthetic ACS microdata, or whatever new methods the Census Bureau comes up with on research. And the user community can help with this, like we did with differential privacy. And to do this, what we need test files that use older ACS data with the new disclosure controls applied, and then we replicate past research findings and see if those findings stand up with the new data. I think the research community is ready and able to do this. Give us some test files, and we will test. So these two research streams, new re-identification experiments and testing of the scientific impact of any changes in disclosure control, these are what we need if we want to optimize the trade-off between usability and risk. Partially synthetic methods, I think, may prove to be feasible as a means of protecting confidentiality. It's also possible that it might be more effective to do highly targeted swapping strategies. But those are empirical questions. What's clear is that the fully synthetic option is not feasible and should not be pursued. So my main point here is that any benefits of eliminating access to public use ACS microdata are highly uncertain, but the costs are enormous. If the ACS data, microdata are eliminated, it's going to cause huge damage to the nation's statistical infrastructure. The visionary census leader, Konrad Teuber, was the person most responsible for inventing public use microdata in the first place. He wrote a proposal for the 1960 public use sample in 1959, and in it he wrote, "It is essential to this proposal that these materials would be equally available to anyone, and that the user would be as free to use them or subsamples of them as he saw fit." And I think this underscores the fact that public data are public good. It matters whether data are accessible to a broad public or restricted to a narrow elite. And if reliable data become inaccessible or available only to select investigators, it's going to make research more expensive. It'll make research less reproducible. It'll make some research completely impossible. And we don't want the government to pick and choose which researchers get access to data. That's a core threat to science. So a couple of months ago, I published an article on this. So if those of you who want more information, more detail on this, it's in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And if you don't have access and want an ungated copy of the paper, just email me at ruggles@umn.edu, and I will get you a copy immediately. Thank you.
All right, excellent, thank you. And our third and final presentation is by Ana Sanchez Rivera from our dear friends at the Census Bureau, leveraging instrument test paradata, a term I was not familiar with before hearing about it. Strategies for managing sensitive data challenges. Take it away, Ana.
Thank you so much. My name is Ana Sanchez Rivera, and I will be presenting part of the research with Ray Ellis, and she will be with me in the Q&A session, and that we have been working on. So we are very excited to share this work here because part of our purpose was to provide you with some behind the scenes of the ACS data collection steps that we do at Census to ensure data quality. And as a bonus, we are going to showcase ACS data used for internal research that is not publicly available. So we hope that you enjoy the topic. We're going to be, this is our roadmap. We are going to be talking about what is the internet paradata and the key test data, look at the research questions, talk about the data sets that we're going to be comparing for the findings, and finally discuss the lessons learned and the conclusions. So paradata is essentially the information collected during the process of conducting a survey that are not the survey answers. It includes markings on a paper form or notes taken by the interviewers. But internet paradata itself is an artifact from programming processes that keeps a record of every action taken during the survey because the path depends on these actions. It is relatively inexpensive to collect because, again, the survey depends on it. And these data are created by default from the interaction with the questionnaire that is often ignored. But they provide information about the respondents' behavior, which means it can let us know about the issues the respondents face while completing the survey. And for example, the time spent on a question, changes to responses, triggering errors, and clicking help links. Some of the challenges of working with these internet paradata is that the data are large, are complex, and unstructured, which difficults programming and make it very time consuming. And it requires the analyst to develop specialized skills to understand it. Also, and the data is protected by Title 13, which makes training very challenging. To overcome the challenges of internet paradata, we are proposing to use a type of synthetic paradata that we're calling for this presentation key test data. I say type of because it's different from synthetic data, which is more computer-generated data. These key test data are created by the user acceptance testing when the subject matter experts, SMEs, are testing the instrument before it is released. So the process of testing creates a fake data record for all the actions in the survey, like it will do with a respondent. And so the SME's main task is to test their questions against a specification file, which is technically the instructions given to the programmers of what needs to happen when a person selects a response in the online questionnaire. For example, if they answer yes, go to the next question. If they answer no, go to the question after that. When the SMEs are doing this, they are looking for typos in the questions or the response categories to find bugs or errors in the program path to test functionality. So most of them try to imitate behavior respondents in the real respondents, which includes trying to break the instrument or the survey. So for this research, we are asking, and now that we have this paradata created by the SMEs from the user's assistant test, can we use it for another purpose? So for this presentation, the purpose is to assess how the key test paradata can help us developing a programming code to analyze the final paradata set months before we receive it. Our main research questions were, does the structure and the content of this key test paradata align with those from the final data set? Does these key test data support an accurate development of the processing code? And finally, is it effective to use this key test data set when developing processing code in terms of time and effort? So for this presentation, we're focusing on the Hispanic origin question because internal research found that it was one of the most difficult questions to answer in the 2020 census. We know from cognitive testing that even Spanish speakers struggle with the question, so we thought that it was a good opportunity to test our code with it. For this, we used two data sets. The 2024 ACS key test paradata has the synthetic paradata, and the 2022 DY 2022 ACS paradata has the real paradata. And we slice the data sets to look only at the Hispanic origin question. For this presentation, we're going to compare the time spent in the question, missing responses, and error messages triggered by both the synthetic and the real data set. So now we're going to look at some of the results that show both data sets by side by side. And this is not to focus, I know that we're going to be tempted to do that, but this is not to focus on the results themselves, but to show how pre-programming this analysis using the key test paradata allow us to efficiently analyze the real data when it becomes available. So this slide shows the time spent in the Hispanic origin question. The one on the left, you see the results for the key test data set, and the one on the right, the ones for the 2022 ACS paradata. The first thing that jumps out is that the difference in the distributions. So we can see that the structure on the key test paradata was good to develop the code because the 2022 ACS paradata showed frequency for all the time categories created. However, because the distributions are different, we have a limitation in content, as we can't use the key test paradata as a guide to create meaningful time categories. For a deeper analysis, we will need to revisit the code and break the categories down differently. This slide shows a graph and that I created to identify case numbers. says we wanted to remove that we might wanted to remove because they had unusually long or short time in the question. It looked at a very reasonable decision when looking at the key test paradata, but as you can see in the graph on the right, even though it's still good tool to utilize to visualize and identify those extreme cases, it's no longer as straightforward. In this case, the key test paradata supported the development of an accurate code. This has a good use of the time and the effort, but because the content and in this case the number of cases and the time spent on the questions are so different from the real data set, we concluded that we couldn't use the key test paradata to make this data wrangling decisions. This slide shows the percentage of respondents who provided the answers to the Hispanic origin questions compared to those who didn't. We can see that the key test paradata supports the accurate development of the processing code because even though it was higher, it has a higher percentage of unanswered responses compared to the real data set. That will not be that will not affect our coding besides graph aesthetics. And to finish the findings, in this slide shows the error messages triggered in the Hispanic origin question. Error messages occur when the respondent tries to skip the question without choosing a response category or select a checkbox and doesn't provide or doesn't type something in the writing. So here you see one of the limitations of the key test paradata that only pick up on 2 errors, while the 2022 ACS paradata showed that respondents found a way to trigger a 3rd error. In this case, the paradata didn't tell us the specific error message, but we suspect that it might be related with the interaction with other parts of the survey, like trying to exit the section or the survey without the correct protocol. So we believe that even when we find unexpected things like a 3rd error, writing the processing code with the key test data was good investment in terms of our time and effort because the new error required a minimal adjustment once the code was already written. So to summarize the findings and answer the overall questions, can we use this type of synthetic paradata used by the created by the SMEs to write a code before we receive the real paradata file? Yes, we recommend that. Does the data mirror the structure of the final data set? Yes, it closely mirrors the structure because most respondent categories align across both data sets. Does it mirror the content? Well, it has some hiccups because the frequency distributions didn't follow the same patterns of the real data. And that limited our ability to create meaningful response groupings like we saw in the time categories, but it's still a very good place to start. Does it support an accurate development of the processing code? The key test paradata allow us to write a correct and valid code, even when the 2022 ACS paradata was older. It didn't fully align the way that the Census Bureau is collecting the paradata now. In that aspect, I just did some minor adjustments to update the column tables, the column names, and it was good. So is it efficient to use in terms of time and effort when developing a processing code? We really recommend the use of this data because you get it in months in advance compared to the real data. Even though it is not perfect and requires several adjustments, it is a great investment of the time and effort. So what did we learn? To reiterate what I said in the previous slide, there are some great advantages to those adding that we could use it for teaching and sharing because key test data is not protected data. But there are some limitations, like it cannot be used to confirm research questions or hypotheses because it doesn't accurately mimic the real life patterns. And the sample size difference need to be considered when developing codes for graphics. So the difference in the frequencies require us to adjust the visualizations to improve aesthetics clarity. We'll require to go back to and edit some of the categories, and that might start a series of changes to the program. And finally, this difference in frequencies allows an error to go unnoticed for one of the graphs that because the original denominator was incorrect but looked reasonable in the key test paradata. But it was only unmasked when we had the real data set. So to finalize, this is the list of the next steps that we have in mind. We plan to apply this framework to ongoing projects. We plan to develop training materials to be used census-wide so other analysts can effectively use Paradata, especially now that the census is moving to standardize the Paradata structure for all the surveys that we talked in one of the first sessions. And we want to continue to use it to categorize observed patterns that can help us to contextualize respondents' behaviors in future analyses, and use it to try to define analytical parameters to create benchmarks like what constitutes short or long time on a question. Do these parameters change depending on the question or the question type? Or to see if the patterns observed across surveys. From the research presented here, we found a project that we would like to pursue further. This chart was fascinating for us as it shows the cases where respondents changed their Hispanic origin responses at least once, and the color refers to the direction of change. For this graph, we cannot tell the respondent's final response to the Hispanic origin question, but it shows how dynamic and complex is the process of selecting a response, especially around the blanking the responses or selecting yes, other Hispanic or not Hispanic. We know certain populations have difficulties, more difficulties than other responding these questions. We believe that this visualization reflects this, but this is just a teaser, so stay tuned. Thank you so much for your time and your attention. And these are our email addresses in case that you want to contact us or follow us for questions. Thank you so much.
All right, excellent. So thank you to all of our speakers. Looking at the clock, it looks like we have 22 minutes left for questions. So we've got one in the chat already, in the Q&A box rather. So please feel free to submit additional questions and I will read them off. So our first question is from Connie Citro, who asks, my question is whether the Census Bureau is still pursuing the concept of a fully synthetic ACS PUMS file, or whether it will take Steve Ruggles' suggestions for further research on the threats and the benefits and costs of different protection methods to heart. Will the Census Bureau be open to targeted protection methods so that the bulk of the ACS PUMS data remains publicly available to all? So I'll throw that to Stephen first, since he was mentioned by name, but certainly the other two speakers are free to address that question as well.
Yeah, thanks, Connie. I, as you know, completely agree with you. That is the question. And I have been asking that, as you have, for some time, and hopefully we'll get some answers.
All right. Many future questions on the topic, I'm sure. So while those of you put some questions in the Q&A box, I'll go ahead and throw some out of my own. So the first one is to Joseph. So yeah, your very well developed presentation there, focused on the VA patients and healthcare. So I guess the question I have is, what are some of the other use cases that you can imagine for similar sorts of research? Are there additional types of amenities like parks or schools or food desert avoidance that would be a particularly fruitful study for you or someone else?
Great question. Yeah, so we have several kind of proof of concept examples that we've built out that look at other kinds of resource access issues, including food deserts. So we had presented a poster at the Population Association of America conference last year, focused on kind of identifying food deserts relative to the sort of parameters within the USDA's Food Access Research Atlas. So that is a data product and that kind of characterizes census tract populations by their level of access to grocery stores based on kind of the Euclidean distance between the center of a census tract and a store's location. So there's kind of a lot, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk there, that can be refined using synthetic populations and transportation network data, where you are considering specific physical residential locations of agents in the synthetic population and routing them to those grocery store locations. So using that kind of information, you can develop kind of this cross-sectional understanding of not just where low income, low access populations, as the Food Access Research Atlas describes, reside, but also things like vehicle access, living arrangement, sensitivity, and age that are all sort of linked to that issue of food access. So yeah, that's another, nutrition and food access is another area we definitely spent some time on.
Excellent. And I see that one of your co-authors has put a couple links in the chat box, so anybody who's interested in that topic can take a look at that. So let me throw a question to Anna. This is certainly, I guess I had thought about this topic in a more abstract way, as we've had the previous discussions about how to categorize race and ethnicity and the existing orders on that topic. So the question I would have is there another, similar kind of question, is there another use case that immediately comes to mind of how you can use paradata analysis of the sort that you described to glean additional insights? Oh, you're on mute.
It had to happen at some point, right? So we at the Center of Behavioral Science Methods, CBSM, we do a lot of research with Paradata, specifically with ACS Paradata, and we're looking more of how the respondents understand the questions and how we can make them better or easy to understand. So we're using it a lot more for cognitive testing, combining it with qualitative data with the interviews and everything. But several parts of the census work on the Paradata for many other purposes. So I don't know, Ray Ellis is my co-author.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. So Paradata is such a rich source of data because it really shows the path of respondents across the path. So we use Paradata for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons we use it is to test itself, right? So looking at response data in Paradata to make sure that our Paradata is recording people correctly, right? And that we're getting what we'd expect out of the Paradata. We use it to look at improving questions. We use it to monitor questions. So one of the projects we're working on at Census is a dashboard with the DICE project that you heard about earlier. We would like to be able to have a dashboard that works for all surveys, for surveys to be able to monitor their data using their Paradata. So they can tell if people are having issues logging on, if there's a question or some sort of issue right away that can be responded to and dealt with. So Paradata is really a really, really rich source. We use it at CBSM a lot to look at improving surveys and improving sort of the reducing burden, improving the experience. All of that means having trained people and people who are able to deal with this very complex data. And that's and also process things and get papers out and information out on the sort of schedule that surveys have to process data, right? So this project was really about resolving that issue of the fact that sometimes we're trying to train analysts while we're in the process timeline and pipeline, which is really challenging. And so if we can use the data that is already produced as we test instruments to get people trained and to write programs in advance, then we sort of get ahead of the curve of the challenges, and then we can really utilize Paradata to its full advantage. So that's sort of a long answer to your question of sort of why we're doing this in this particular way, but also generally how we use Paradata.
Okay. And thank you for jumping in. That was Anna's co-author, in case I wasn't clear. All right. So there's a lot of conversation in the chat about Stephen's talk, obviously a hot button topic. One comment that I do want to highlight, because it's in the Q&A, so I'm not sure everybody can see it, is from Clara Roshovsky, who says, I fully support more research in synthetic data, but I do raise the longstanding concern that re-identification does not matter if it is correct or not. The re-identification can still cause problems for the data program. I would hate to see ACS lose funding or support over re-identification is accurate or not. It goes on from there. So on that topic, Stephen, since there is a lot of fodder to work with here, I think the thing that's most interesting to me is this concept of these re-identification studies, which, as you say, there's been a substantial dearth of. So I guess the question would be, what would that look like for somebody who was interested in that topic? What would be the approaches that would be used for those of us who did not read that paper you mentioned in your presentation? And then the last thing is that, the main thing that's changed in the last few years is generative AI. So the question would be, do you think that adds any additional risk to identification versus previous times this topic's been discussed?
Yeah, I think it might, and I think that the argument that the Census Bureau constantly uses that there's just a lot more data out there. You got Palantir and all this stuff, and the quality of the commercial data sources is improving. That combined with new methods, potentially AI, could mean that there now is some risk, but they haven't tried to investigate that, and just saying, oh, we've got to take away all of the data just in case there might be some risk is not good enough. I think that it's a huge mistake. As I say, this is one of the most important scientific resources, not just social science resources. Among all scientific databases, this is one of the most intensively used in the world. And the idea that you would endanger that just based on a feeling doesn't seem right. It seems like you would want to demonstrate a risk, and if you did it, and if you found a risk, then you could figure out a strategy to mitigate that risk without throwing out the baby out with the bathwater. The argument that it doesn't matter whether people actually can be positively identified in a microdata file because just the allegation that they could is bad enough. Well, those allegations have been there forever, and it doesn't actually seem to have much bearing on it. If you look at the numbers about the percentage of people responding to the Census Bureau surveys that the census is an invasion of privacy, that's been going down for 40 years, except for a slight uptick in 2000 when George Bush candidate George Bush said, "Oh, the long form's an invasion of privacy," I wouldn't answer that if I were you. That obviously doesn't help. But we know from the survey research literature that when you give people big confidentiality guarantees, response rates go down, not up. And that's because people all of a sudden start getting worried about disclosure. People in general are worried about the government using the data for bad purposes, like immigration or something like that. They're not worried about somebody breaking into a statistical database that's used for research. I mean, this is not something that's a realistic fear, I think.
I
do think new research is needed, and we should try to make disclosure impossible, or as close to impossible as possible.
Absolutely, yeah. 5 years of this, and we still have trouble with the mute button, don't we? So I want to highlight Gary Benedetto's comment in the chat, and he's a Census Bureau employee, and says, full synthesis research is still going on at the Census Bureau, but keep in mind that the plan would be to only release that with the support of a validation service where users could get answers from the underlying data with less intrusive disclosure protections than what they are currently used to with the PUMs. They would just no longer be able to directly interact with the non-synthetic data. So that is more or less the characterization that Stephen shared earlier. So Anna, Joseph, I don't know if you two have any thoughts on this topic that you'd like to share.
Nothing specific.
Okay. All right. So both the other panelists are steering clear of this one, which I can't blame them for. So I will go ahead and give everybody another couple minutes if there's something you want to, a question. I think we do have a new question. From Gary, who I was just quoting. Is there a source for the claim on what motivates people's concern? I think that's to you, Stephen, for your recent remarks.
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
Is there a source for the claim on what motivates people's concern? You were speaking about people are afraid of the government. They're not afraid of,
Yeah, I have a paper with Diana Magnuson in the Population and Development Review from, was that 24? I think, called "It's None of Their Damn Business," which is a quote from Senator Hagel. But we review the literature in that paper. What we know about census privacy concerns over the long run. We start in 1790, and we identify 3 big waves of census concern about census intrusion. That was in 1940, 1970, and 2000. And in all these 3 cases, you can figure out what caused it, and mostly it was the politicians who were stirring up trouble. But there were other particular things in each case. But anyway, so that's I think a good starting point. We cite all the rest of the literature on that, and you can also find some stuff in the PNAS article that I just published.
Okay, excellent. And the other thing I'll highlight is there's a note in here that if you have privacy questions for the Census Bureau, feel free to send them to acsprivacy@census.gov. So that would be your point of contact. So I'll give everybody just another little bit if you got any final questions or comments to share with the group. If I don't see anything in the next couple minutes, I think we'll go ahead and wrap this up. So there will be a break after this session. So we will reconvene for the final set of breakouts at 4 o'clock. And I don't see anything else in the chat, so I think we will go ahead and shut this down. So thanks, everybody. Thanks to our panel, Joseph, Anna, and Stephen for their thoughtful presentations. And like I said, we'll see you back here at 4 o'clock.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.